So I think we're going to start and let people pop in as they do. Kerrigan's just joined her here. June He has just joined. Owen has joined. Simeon's joined. So, and Rael said, yes, schools close all the time for polar bears. So I'm going to turn you over to some amazing people, Connected North at Home friends. These are the people who know so much about polar bears. Their job is to teach people about polar bears. They work with an organization called Polar Bears International. So they know so much about polar bears and they look after the polar bears, and they are just the best organization to be teaching us about this apex predator in the north. So we have two scientists with us today. We have Jenny and KT, and we're going to actually get Katie to Birch to pin Jenny because she's going to start us off. And then KT is going to show us some super fun, way cool things that you'll never see anywhere else. So let's turn it over to Jenny, and we're going to learn all about polar bears. Now, guys, remember, if you have questions, we are going to stop partway through. I'll do my best to keep my eye on the chat, but I know we're going to have tons of questions. We always do. So let's hold our questions, listen to Jenny first, and then we'll come back for questions when it's time. Okay, so I'll introduce you to Jenny. Over to you, Jenny.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to talk about polar bears today with you all. And so let's make sure. Can you see the screen? Is it sharing okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So today we're going to talk all about polar bears and hopefully answer some of your questions. I'd like to start by talking about where I am and where I'm talking about polar bears right now. I'm located in Seattle, Washington. And so there's that red dot on the map over there. Maybe you can try to find yourself on the map. And so I live in Seattle. One of the things we're most known for is the Space Needle. And I'm here sheltering in place in my home with my 3 pets and my partner. And so I have a really fat calico cat, a big dog, and I have a frog. And so even though I don't have any polar bears with me, I do still get to be surrounded by animals. So hopefully everyone's staying safe, and maybe they have some animal buddies of their own to keep them company. So to get started with the main animal we're talking about today, polar bears. And polar bears are really, really special because they live in a really extreme environment. As you guys probably know, the Arctic gets really, really cold, and these bears don't have somewhere where they can go inside and sit by a fire or sit by a heater. So they have to have all of the things that keep them warm on their body and part of just who they are. So they're built in a really, really special way, and we'll talk about that today. So let's talk a little bit about what polar bears are like. And this is a very close-up photo of a polar bear. Hopefully none of you ever get this close to a polar bear, but I think this was kind of more of a camera. So polar bears are the biggest of all of the bears, and so they are part of a bear family, like it sounds like a lot of you guys have seen. We also have black bears all around North America and grizzly bears. So maybe you can tell your friends in the chat. I think so you guys already have what kind of bears you've seen, but polar bears are the biggest of all of these bears. And something that's special about polar bears is the boys and the girls are actually pretty different sizes. And so the females are on the smaller side, whereas the males can sometimes be twice the size of the female, and they can get up to 600 kilograms. Sorry, I'm transitioning from pounds to kilograms since I know most of our audiences thinks in kilograms. But these polar bears can get really, really big, much bigger than the other bears. And they have this really, really special fur that's kind of the main thing that keeps them warm. They have 2 layers of fur. They have this kind of soft under fur that's a little bit like a sweater. And then they have these long guard hairs that go over that under fur that's kind of like wearing a raincoat. And I saw someone on the chat earlier today that said that they knew what's under that fur. And that is, they have black skin. And we don't know exactly why they have that black skin, but it helps keep them warm. So on this PowerPoint slide, I have a picture of a bear in a zoo who has his paw shaved. And so that's, we took all the hair off of that paw so that we could, check up on him. He was at a doctor's appointment, and you can see that that skin is very, very dark. And we think that that can help absorb heat because, like I said, these bears have to work really hard to stay warm. This is also from that doctor's appointment. Polar bears have really, really big paws. So this is my hand holding up to the polar bear paw. This bear's name is Blizzard. And you can see that these paws are very covered in fur. And then on the bottom, if you look really closely at the underside, you'll see that they have kind of these like sandpapery paws, and those actually help them stick on the ice. So that when they walk on the ice, they can use those paws to stay in one place and not slip and slide around. I don't know if any of you guys have ever tried to run around when it's icy outside, but it can be pretty slippery, and that's bears have to walk on that a lot. So they have these kind of built-in traction pads or not spikes, but something that helps their paws stick. And so I have this video, if it works, of a bear walking, and you'll see that the bear sometimes looks like it's even walking on water, and the paws are really, really big and spread out so that they can distribute their weight as they walk along that ice, and they're not slipping and sliding around. So that is kind of what happens with those sticky paws and those big paws that can distribute up to 600 kilograms worth of weight. So that's pretty awesome. And the bears can smell their dinner really, really far away. So if you imagine that you're a polar bear on this vast expanse of ice, it might be kind of hard to locate your dinner. It's not like they can just walk to the kitchen and find their dinner. So they have to use their really, really powerful noses to smell where the seals are, and then they walk over and find those seals. And we'll talk a little bit more about their sense of smell when KT joins us with the adaptations kit. Polar bears have really small ears and short tails, and so you may think that this is just kind of a coincidence, but actually biologists have studied this, and they find that animals that live in colder climates actually have really close to their body appendages or our body parts. And so they won't have giant ears, maybe like an elephant, because that would increase the amount of surface area or body part exposed to the cold. So they keep their ears and their tails are really, really small so that they don't have to worry about keeping more and more of their body warm. And I saw someone point this out on the chat too, but they have these really, really long and pointed nose. If you've ever seen a grizzly bear, they're kind of bulky and they have this big head and this kind of wide nose, whereas polar bears, it's kind of very sleek and pointed, and that's because they have to reach into these really small breathing holes that the seals use. The seals claw holes into the ice, and the polar bears stick their heads down into those holes, and in order to do that, they kind of have to have this nice cone-shaped head. So it's long and pointed so that they can get to their dinner. And so that they can catch their dinner, they have these really, really big teeth. If you feel in your own mouth with your tongue, we don't want to be touching our faces. You can see that you have these canines. Those are the sharp teeth in your mouth. And if you kind of put your tongue back to the back of your mouth, you'll feel that you have these molars. And so polar bears, they have these sharp canines that they can use to grab seals. And they also have really, really sharp molars, which are those teeth in the back of our mouth. And those help them rip the blubber off of seals. And so their mouths are perfectly adapted to catch the seals that they're catching. And yes, those are my fingers. So you can tell that these are really big teeth. And I've been talking a lot about what they're eating. Polar bears will eat basically anything that they can find. They are roaming the ice looking for food, but their favorite food is a ringed seal. So this is kind of the equivalent as if we ate 50 sticks of butter. This is a very, very fatty animal. And so seals love, or polar bears love to find these seals and eat all of the fat off of them. They'll also eat other types of animals if they find them. There's a bigger seal called a bearded seal, which would be like if we ate 100 sticks of butter, kind of double the fat of a ring seal. And then they'll also, if they can, they'll eat a narwhal or a walrus or a beluga whale, but those are sometimes harder to catch and to find. And so ring seals are really, really their bread and butter, their main thing that they eat. So I have a short video. This is actually a bearded seal. I think I need to, oh, there we go. So that's a bearded seal on the ice, and the polar bear will kind of sneak up on the bear, or sneak up on the seal and try to catch it. So the bear won't have a lot of luck catching the seal if it's in the water, so they have to catch these seals while they're in the ice, because seals are much faster swimmers than polar bears. Oh, there's the video again. And so that's kind of what I'll talk about for the adaptations video, but we have this really cool video that was put together by another person that works at Polar Bears International that shows you some fun animations. And so we'll try to play that, and then we'll get to look at a polar bear claw and some polar bear fur and some other really cool things after this. So we will try to see if this video works.
Is there supposed to be sound, Jenny?
There is. I thought it was playing, but
So you have to turn off your sound, your microphone.
should I stop the video? I think I have it on full sound here.
Yeah, maybe let's stop it and we'll try and start it with sound. So turn your sound off, and then at the top of your screen, you should be able to go to communicate and maybe change the sound to come from your laptop. Potentially, you could just talk us through the video too, Jenny.
Yeah, now Jenny, we can't hear you now, so maybe activate if you want to, if you could read it to the students and maybe explain it as as we start again.
Yeah, we'll start it over. All right. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. So we're going to basically just talk through what I showed you on the slides, but this shows some of the places that polar bears live. And so you can see that these bears walk across really, really large areas, and they do this to look for the seals and to look for dinner. And so you'll see there's actually some blood from a seal that the polar bears caught. This is a close-up of polar bear fur. And this just kind of shows you an animation of that short fuzzy down layer and those long guard hairs that protect that warm sweater that these polar bears are wearing. And so something that a lot of people don't know is that polar bear hair is clear. It's not actually white. It just looks white to our eyes. And we think that that hollowness helps them maintain heat. This here just kind of shows that black skin that helps maintain the heat. We'll get to look at a skull a little bit later, but that shows you just how much area they have in their skull to pick up smells so that they can find their seals. This is a casting of a polar bear paw, and it's kind of the size of a dinner plate. So maybe when you're eating dinner tonight, you can imagine that the plate in front of you is actually a giant polar bear paw. And you can imagine what that would be like to walk across the ice with that really, really big plate. And the paws are really, really, they emit smells. And so they have kind of smelly footprints where they leave messages for other polar bears who will smell their footprints and try to find out, you know, if a bear has been there, and kind of messages that they leave for each other. We'll see a polar bear claw in just a little bit, but as you can see, they're really, really curved, and they use that to drag the seal onto the sea ice. Here's the skull again, and you can see those really sharp canines and those also sharp molars on the back. And then they have that space in between those canines and those molars, and that helps them hold the seal in between those really sharp teeth and then those teeth that pull the blubber on the back of it. So this is, all of those features help the bears live in the Arctic and live on the ice. But what we're kind of finding now is that we're losing a lot of that ice. And so these bears that are perfect for the ice are kind of losing their home. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. So hopefully that was helpful to talk over the video. I'm sorry that the sound didn't work. Yeah, so I thought that we could take a PowerPoint break and look at some of those things that were in the videos and in the slides with KT and talk about them, and then maybe you guys can all take a break and stretch a little bit as we do that. So I guess I will.
You just need to unshare your screen, Jenny. Ah, perfect. I'll pin KT.
That's the first step.
KT, maybe we can start with the fur. KT is holding up a patch of polar bear fur. And I want you guys to look really closely and see if you can see those nice long guard hairs. Those are kind of that outer protective layer. And then if we look deep into that fur, we can actually see the kind of soft, downy under fur. And so those two layers together work together to keep the bear really warm. And I saw someone in the chat mention, what do the bears do in the summer? Because they, they still always have this fur. And so the bears will kind of move a little bit less because they can't take off their coat kind of the same way that we can take off a raincoat or a sweater. Yeah. Let's see, I think we also have a claw. So KT is holding up that polar bear claw. As you can see, it's really, really curved. And so they use that to hook their prey. And they have a really, really sharp edge so that they can really dig into the seal and pull it out of the water. And yes, it's really, really big. They also sometimes will use their claws when they're walking on the ice so that they don't slip around as much. But primarily it's so that they can catch their dinner. And I think we have a skull. Perfect. So as you can see, this skull is massive. And as the video was talking about, they have these really, really sharp teeth where they can grab the seals. And so right now, KT is showing us the canines, and you can see that they're big and curved. And then if we can turn the skull around, we can see those really sharp molars. So if you think about a horse or us or anything that eats mostly plants, ours are kind of flat for grinding, but their molars are sharp for taking off the blubber of an animal. Also, something that was mentioned kind of quickly in the video is the space where their nose is. And so if we can look at the front of the skull, you'll see that there's so much surface area in there. There's a lot of space and there's a lot of folds, and that's so that the smell has as much area as possible to get into the polar bear system and where they can kind of locate and smell. Something else that they use to smell is actually on the inside of their skull. If we could open up that top, you'll see a hole. Yep, right there. There's kind of the two nostril holes, and then there's that hole right there. That's where their Jacobson's organ is. And so I don't know if anyone has ever seen a snake, and when snakes kind of go around, they stick their tongue out to smell. Polar bears actually have the same organ that snakes do to smell, and they will also stick their tongue out to bring air through that hole in their mouth, that Jacobson's organ, to smell things even better. And so I think that is all I'm going to say about the skull. If we could move to the satellite color. Perfect. So this is something that researchers will put on female polar bears. So researchers will fly around the Arctic in helicopters, and they'll land and they'll put the bear to sleep for a little bit, and then they'll put this collar around the female's neck. That really big part right there, that's the battery pack, because this collar has to stay charged up for 2 or 3 years. So if it's, maybe your phone has to charge every single night, we can't do that in the Arctic. So we have to put these really, really big battery packs. And what this satellite collar does is it sends messages up to satellites in space saying where a polar bear is. So it tells us the location of the polar bear. That satellite sends information to us in our offices telling us where that bear is. And we get locations, like I said, for up to 3 years. And so it's pretty amazing. And you may be wondering, why do we care where these polar bears are? Knowing where the polar bears are and whether they're using the ice, whether the ice has started to form, whether the moms are denning. So female polar bears will go into these snow dens to have their babies. And if they're wearing these collars, we can tell how long they're in the dens, when they leave their dens, and information like that. We also have something that we put on the males, a GPS ear tag. And I'm going to definitely pause for questions after this. So I'm excited to hear your guys' thoughts. So this is like an earring, and you can see that long antenna that does the same thing as the satellite collar, more or less. It sends it to something else, but it uses those satellites and sends the locations for a shorter amount of time, because you'll notice this is much smaller than the collar, so it can't last as long as the 2 to 3 years. This can last up to around 6 months, and we put this on our male polar bears. And I'll explain this a little bit later when we go back to the PowerPoint, but the male polar bears have these really, really big necks and big heads, and so they can just push the collars right off. And so that's why we put these ear tags on them to figure out where the males are moving. I think that's all we have in our kit. Is that right, KT? Perfect. So now maybe we could pause for some questions before we go back to the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so we'll, okay, so there's lots of questions. So how long do polar bears live?
That's a great question. So the males can live kind of to their early 20s, like 18 to 22 years old, whereas the females live a little bit longer. They're kind of more towards like 24, 26 years old. In the wild, we do have some really old polar bears in zoos. I think one of the oldest polar bears is actually near me in Washington. His name is Boris, and he's 32 years old, but I think a polar bear in captivity lived up to 40 years old. So if they aren't having to search for their dinner every night, they can live pretty long.
Wow. Eleanor wants to know what eats polar bears. Like, they're the apex predator, so who are they afraid of?
That's another great question. So humans actually will hunt polar bears, and they will use some of their meat for food, and they can use the pelts for clothing to keep themselves warm. I know that a lot of polar bear hunters will wear polar bear pants because that fur is kind of so good at keeping heat that they make really good clothing for people that live in the north and it's really, really cold there. So yeah, I'd say humans are the biggest predator. They have found some polar bear remains in Greenland shark stomachs. And so we don't think that the Greenland sharks are hunting the bears, but we think that they must be eating some of them maybe once they die and go into the water.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Abby wants to know, what is the time lapse when is the time they have their babies?
Yeah, so polar bears will mate in the spring, and then they have something in their bodies that allow them to wait to become pregnant. So polar bears will wait to become pregnant until the fall, and then they will go into these snow caves kind of in November, October, November, and then they're going to have their babies in around January or so. And these babies are going to be really, really small. They're going to be like half a kilogram. And those babies will grow up with their mom inside the snow den for a couple of months, and then the mom will come out with her babies the next spring.
That is so cool. I bet it's exciting to see them come out of their dens.
Yeah.
Owen would like to know how big or how small or how big are baby polar bears?
Yeah, so baby polar bears are really, really small. They're about half a kilogram. They kind of look like little bunny rabbits or something like that. But they grow really, really fast. And so the mom is feeding them milk, and the milk is a little bit different than the milk we drink. because it's really, really rich in fat. And so these bears grow really, really fast. And by the time they leave the den, they can be kind of up to like around 30 pounds or so. Up to, I can't do that conversion in my head right now. Sorry.
15 kilograms. That's okay. We think in both ways.
Someone wants to know how much they weigh in pounds. They weigh about 1 pound when they're born.
Okay, cool. And Sierra wants to know, how long can polar bears swim?
So polar bears can swim they don't like to be in the water that long because it's harder for them to stay warm. So they will swim kind of just for a couple miles or kilometers at a time. But the longest that they can swim that we've seen is around 62 miles or 100 kilometers, which is a long time to be in the water. And so the bear was probably pretty cold after that.
That is a long way. And Dawson would like to know, how many polar bears are left in the wild? And is that why you're tracking them? Like, do we track them to know how many there are?
Yeah, so it's really hard to know how many polar bears are left in the wild. Right now, we think there's about 26,000 to around 30,000. So that's a pretty big range, but we think that that's how many individuals there are. That we do catch polar bears to figure out how many there are, because we figure out that we can kind of catch a subset of the population, and then we see if we catch the same polar bears the next year, and then we can do some math and figure out how many there are. But the tracking doesn't necessarily help us figure out how many there are.
Okay. And why do polar bears like seals the best? Charlie and AJ want to know that.
So Charlie and AJ, they like seals so much because they're really, really fatty. And so polar bears have a special digestive system that basically functions off of fat. And seals have blubber, which is really, really thick fat. And so that's why they're favorite, because they're easier to catch than, let's say, a whale. And they have so much fat on them that they can get enough energy to get through a long amount of time until they can find the next seal.
Jenny, that segues really nicely into whether, does the polar bear eat the entire seal all the time? I know that there's some information about that.
Yeah, most of the time, no. Most of the time, the polar bears will just take the fat off the seal and leave the rest. And so there's a lot of other animals in the Arctic that will like to follow polar bears and eat whatever they leave behind. If a polar bear is really, really hungry, then they'll eat more of the seal, but most of the time they just eat the fat off of the seal and leave the rest.
And Maxime says, you are a very good teacher and you explain everything well. Now, I think you've answered all of the questions that are in the chat so far. So do we want to go on to the next section?
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll explain a little bit more about tracking too in the next section. So I will share my screen again. Right. So this is a picture of a mom with 2 cubs, and you can notice if you look in the picture, you'll see that the mom is wearing a satellite collar. And so this mom has probably emerged from the den recently because of the size of her cubs. But the cubs will actually stay with her for 2 whole years. And so they'll stay with her the year that they come out of the den. They'll stay with her when they're 1 year old. And then after, once they're 2 years old, they'll leave their mom. So if you can imagine only having 2 years with your parents to learn everything about how to keep you safe and how to find food, they have to learn a lot in a really short amount of time. And we can kind of track where their mom's going and figure out where the cubs are going by using that information from their mom. I have a short video just showing move around with the collar, you'll see that she can wear it kind of just like a cat or a dog wears a collar. She has that neck where it kind of sits well, and that will help it stay on for about 2 years. And once 2 years finishes, usually there's enough wear and tear on the collar that it just falls right off. So the bear doesn't have to live with it for its entire life. So we get information like this, and this is actually available on the Polar Bears International website. So you could look and see some of the bear tracking there, but this is one bear's movement path from one of those collars. And so you'll see, it looks like the bear is just out on the open water with how this map looks, but that's actually ice. And so we can see this, I guess, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the bear started on land and waited for the ice to form and then went out on Hudson Bay once there was ice, and we can kind of see the path that she took while she was looking for food and looking for seals to eat. And so we can do that for every individual bear that was wearing a satellite collar. And so we'll see that this bear actually took kind of a different path than the other bear. And something that I'll talk about a little bit later is that bears actually, we split them up into 19 subpopulations. So kind of like states or cities or ways that, humans put boundaries on stuff. We do the same thing with polar bears. And we think that there is 19 of these separate populations. And we do use the movement patterns from the collars to help figure out what bear goes in what population. Like I said before, we don't have information long-term about where the male polar bears go. And this is a photo I took in Churchill, and you can see that there's very little difference between where the bear's neck ends and where his face starts. And so this is kind of what I was talking about before, where it's really hard to put an collar on an animal when their neck is the same size as their head. And so this is just a picture of that ear tag put onto a bear, just kind of like an earring. So we can get short-term information about where the boy polar bears are going. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do as a polar bear scientist. So like I said before, I am getting my PhD, so I'm in graduate school in Seattle, and I actually study a group of polar bears that's shared between Greenland and Canada. I study the Baffin Bay polar bear population. And so you can see on this map, it's the red highlighted population, but you can see all 19 subpopulations and kind of the boundaries that us humans put on these bears to help figure out, what's happening to the populations and what we can do to help keep them safe as our environment is changing pretty quickly with climate change. And so I study the bears here, and this is actually a map of the collars that the bears that I studied. This is what their satellite collars made and was sent to me from their collars. And so from these satellite collars, we figured out that there are two types of bears. There are bears that do what a regular polar bear does in this population, and they cross Baffin Bay. They come from Greenland to Canada, and they stay on Baffin Island for the summer, and then they wait for the ice to reform, and then they move back to Greenland. So they basically spend their summers on the island and then come back to Greenland. But because we have satellite collars on these bears, we figured out that there's a small group of bears that never leave Greenland. They decide that, it's not worth crossing the water, or maybe they missed their chance, the ice melted before they were able to cross the water. And so what I do as a researcher is I try to figure out, is there a difference in what the bears eat for those that do cross the water and cross on the ice, or those that stay home and stay in Greenland all year long. And so that's what I spend my days trying to figure out. And I try to figure this out by using hair samples, and fat samples. But something that I mentioned earlier is that as polar bear researchers, we fly around in helicopters and we put satellite collars on bears, but we also take samples. And so this is a map of all the samples that were collected for my project. And so you'll see all the different shapes show different ages of bears. And so you'll see that there's a lot of bears that were captured. There's actually like 146, I think, and we have hair and fat samples from all of them, which I then take into a lab, and I basically set the hair and the fat on fire, and it turns into gas. And then using a special instrument, a special machine, I can look at how much of each gas there is and figure out what they ate. So it's really cool. It uses chemistry to figure out from hair and fat whether they ate ringed seals or bearded seals or beluga whales or walruses or narwhals. And then I compare them between those two movement patterns. And so kind of going back, I did find that when I looked at the fat samples, these bears showed to eat different things. But when I looked at the hair samples, they were eating the same things. And so that's kind of confusing because we got one answer from one tissue and another answer from another tissue. And so something else that I do is I try to figure out when their hair grew. And so just like your hair, you probably get haircuts every once in a while because your hair grows over time. The same thing happens with polar bears. They have their hair grow out and then it stops, and then they shed their hair, kind of like a dog or a cat sheds, and then it grows back. But we don't know exactly when that hair grows or how long it takes for it to grow. And so another thing I do as a researcher is I work with bears in zoos and I dye their hair. So I put human hair dye on the polar bears that made that purple spot, and I see how long it takes for their roots to show to figure out how long it takes for polar bear hair to grow. And that helps me answer questions like the ones I was asking in Greenland about why aren't we seeing a difference with the hair samples when we are seeing a difference with the fat samples. And kind of the last thing that I'll talk about before we can ask more questions is I want to talk a little bit about when humans actually get to see polar bears. And so Churchill is a really special place, and it's a place that Polar Bears International works out of a lot and does these really special broadcasts in the fall. And they partner with this company that has tundra buggies. And so people can go out in these kind of monster truck buses, and the polar bears can come see the humans, and the humans can see the bears. And this is a really nice opportunity for education because we have a lot of people who have never seen polar bears in their entire life, and they get to see one face to face. And so I got to go this fall, and these are some of the bears that I saw on the tundra buggy. And then I also would give lectures or PowerPoints, just like I'm kind of giving now, to teach the people who came to Churchill about the bears. There's also a special program that Katie was a part of. She was the moderator, the host for Tundra Connections. And this is these are pictures of her and some scientist panelists talking about polar bears while they're actually on Tundra Buggy 1, which is a very special tundra buggy that Polar Bears International broadcasts from. And so you can even watch these videos in the past and hopefully in the future too, to see people who are actually surrounded by polar bears talk and teach about polar bears. And I'll kind of just end this presentation by talking about climate change or global warming. And this is probably something that you've heard about, or maybe you're noticing changes outside your door. But our Earth is changing pretty fast, and it's getting warmer, and this is a really big deal for polar bears and for us because we are losing our Arctic sea ice. And this is where polar bears find their mates. It's where they find their food. It's how they get around. And so without this ice, polar bears are in a lot of trouble. And without this ice, we're in a lot of trouble because it kind of acts as Earth's air conditioner. This ice helps keep the whole entire globe cool by reflecting that really, really hot heat. And so the ice is really important for so many reasons, and I won't get too much into that now, but it's really up to us to protect the polar bear's home and to protect our home. So I would like to talk a little bit about how you guys can help and the things that I'm trying to do to help our polar bear friends. And so kind of our biggest recommendations for kids your age is to learn as much as you can about polar bears and other Arctic animals that you may love, as well as climate change. Kind of try to understand what it means to have so many changes happening so fast. And then when you learn about the polar bears and you learn about climate change, make sure you tell your friends and family. Tell them this really cool fact that you learned about polar bears and how they really, really need sea ice to live, and how, maybe that means taking less plane trips, driving less, making kind of individual choices that help slow the melting of sea ice. And your parents can certainly vote with the climate in mind too. And so every little thing that we can do can make a difference. And Polar Bears International has really great resources on things that kids can do to help these bears. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you. And I'm happy to answer more questions. I will stop sharing the screen.
That was awesome. So we have a couple of questions in the so Maxime would wanted to know if boats are a risk for polar bears.
That's a great question. So kind of the short answer is boats themselves, not really. Polar bears aren't usually going to get like hit by a boat. They can avoid it. But they're more of a risk to polar bears in the fact that they burn lots and lots of fuel. And so when there's increased shipping and increased use of boats, that just means that we're making their home melt even faster. So it's not necessarily the danger like you crossing the street when a car is coming, but more the long-term effects of what boats need in order to run.
That adds to global warming. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So Alexis and Ben would like to know, how do you get so close to the polar bears? How do you train the polar bears to be calm when you put the hair dye on and the collars on? Like, what happens there? And when he was at the vets?
Yeah. So when the bear was at the vet, and when we put the collars on, they actually we use a dart of sedative, which is basically just like a medicine that makes the bear go to sleep for a couple hours. And then the bear wakes up and is completely fine. And that's the only way that we can really like be around a bear without any protective fences or anything like that. When we put the hair dye on, the bear is awake, but we feed him lots of cupcakes. And so there's one person who's feeding cupcakes and marshmallows and their favorite treats, while one person is in the back applying that hair dye through the fence. So distraction.
A distraction. Okay, that's really awesome. I've never heard that before. So Liam wants to know, are there animals that follow the polar bear and eat their leftovers?
Yes. Something that we see a lot are ravens, or kind of down here we see more crows, but ravens will fly around and follow the polar bears, and they'll eat the leftovers. A lot of like gulls will eat the leftovers. So a lot of seabirds also will fly around and eat the leftovers, as well as like Arctic fox and any other animal, and that's just kind of walking around if they see the leftovers. And other polar bears, if they're really hungry, sometimes they'll eat the leftovers of a healthier bear that only ate the fat. So a lot of animals will eat the remains.
Good. So every part gets eaten up.
Eventually.
Sierra wants to know, do polar bears live in other parts of the world outside of the Arctic?
Only in zoos. And so something that a lot of people get confused about is they think that there are polar bears and penguins together, and that's not true. So we don't have any polar bears in Antarctica. Polar bears really only live in the Arctic or the area just below the Arctic in the subarctic. But other places, no, only in zoos.
Okay. And what is the polar bear's, Owen wants to know, what is the polar bear's most dangerous target, I guess? Trait.
Their most, like the biggest danger facing them, or?
I'm not sure. Owen, what is a polar bear's most dangerous threat? Yeah, that's it.
Okay. That I would say is climate change and global warming. Losing that sea ice is the biggest thing for them, because that's also the biggest thing for seals. And if the seals don't have a home, then the bears don't have food.
Okay, good answer. And do baby bear cubs have a special call for their mother? And Eleanor asked that.
That's a really good question, Eleanor. And that's actually something that researchers are studying right now as they put listening devices into the snow dens, and they kind of listen to what the baby polar bears, what sounds they're making to their mother. That's something I don't know a lot about, but that's something that people are studying right now.
I bet you that question came from when we did a session with the Alaska Sea Life Center. Maybe Eleanor was in that session, and there was an animal that made a particular sound for its mother. Do you guys remember what animal that was? Maybe you can let us know.
The seal, yeah.
Yeah.
And it said, ma, ma, and we all. So Charlie would like to know, why does the polar bear look white if it's got translucent fur?
That's a really great question. So it's basically, it has to do with physics, and so I'll do my best with this, but it's the way that the visible light, which we can only see a certain section of light, and it's the way that light passes through that hollow hair, kind of like a prism, and then the way it shows up to us is white. And so it has to do with how light goes through their hair, and also how our eyes work. But I think that's as much detail as I can give.
And that's a perfect explanation. It's physics, and it's that's a really good answer, because it's a difficult thing to explain when you don't have the proper things to show. So we're going to take one more question, and I think Simeon wants to know, what is the most dangerous animal that the polar bear hunts?
I would say the walrus. So even though whales are a little bit bigger, the way that polar bears hunt whales is they drown them. Whereas walruses are the size of a small car, and they have these really pointy tusks. And so it has to be a pretty big and determined polar bear to fight that walrus and to kill the walrus. And they'll usually go for the younger walrus, just because they are so big and they will really defend themselves. And so I'd say that's the hardest thing for them to hunt.
That's interesting, because walruses are quite an interesting animal as well. So Sarah or Jenny and KT, I just want to thank you for an amazing session. I know you guys are coming back during Earth Week to talk about polar bears again, and we're going to learn more about how we can help the polar bears and sort of more that focus. So this was awesome, and to see Katie on the tundra buggy is really cool, and to see the artifacts that you have, KT, was awesome. To see those teeth and claws up close, and Jenny, your research is amazing. To work with so many polar bears and learn so much. So we hope you guys come back for that session, and then in about 40 minutes, we have a session about another animal that lives in the Arctic, a husky dog, who was a hero way back in the night. The dog's name is Balto, and he is a sled dog that has a really great story with Lee. And so we hope you can come back and learn more about the Arctic and more adaptations of animals that live in the Arctic. So thanks, Polar Bears International. You are the greatest partners ever, and so much information, and it's so great. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Jenny.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.